Hannah Dunn 3, March 26, 2024 AD. Gil Sanchez had seen her come in with her friend, but it was Christy that first caught his attention. Hannah dressed fairly conservatively, but Christy had a nice rack and she liked to show it off. She didn't have a very appealing backside, so she made up for it by showing off as much of her legs and boobs as she could. She was a nice girl. Only once had she ever taken money for sex, and it was with a guy she would have slept with anyway. When he slid up to her at the bar and slipped it into the conversation, she took the $500 and went home with him for an hour. She didn't feel guilty about it, but at heart she wasn't that kind of girl. She wasn't the shining light that her friend was. Hannah would never do anything like that. Even if Hannah would have been in the same situation, the proposition of the exchange of money would have been enough to turn Hannah off completely. Christy was a nice girl. Hannah was a good girl. Gil was turned on. The pair of ladies that had sat across the bar from him was smoking hot, and he wanted the one showing off her tits. The other one would do, but he liked the fun bags, and he made sure that they stayed in his peripheral vision when he wasn't looking straight at them. The redhead with the braid had a very pretty face and obviously took great care of herself, but she seemed too hoity-toity. His imagination could run wild all over those titties, but the covered chest was a dead fuck in his mind's eye. The fuckable brunette with a loud laugh looked way more fun, at first. They weren't drunk enough yet. He was going to buy her a drink, but not until she'd had a few first. He was only appealing in that I know I shouldn't so I'm gonna kind of way. He had tattoos on his face and had been in and out of jail so often in his youth that it had become routine, and he'd by the end no longer feared the consequences of his petty crimes. He was a former gang member, part of the Ochos Locos, named for the street number of their origin, and he had the gang emblem tattooed on the side of his neck. Neither Hannah nor Christy knew what the emblem represented, but he didn't know that for sure. All he knew was that his appearance tended to drive off white girls, especially if they recognized the tattoo and especially if they're sober. So he sipped his drink, slowly playing 1 quarter at a time on the video poker machine built into the bar counter in front of where he sat. He had never come into this bar before. This wasn't his part of town. Nobody knew who he was. He'd just happened to narrowly miss his bus transfer and had come in to kill time for the hour-long wait until the next bus and have a drink. Now he had a reason to stay. So the next bus came and went. Girls noticed everything, and they'd seen him sitting across the bar, growing slightly more attractive with every shot, but neither was anywhere near drunk enough to give him the time of day. Guys alone at bars are sketchy. They looked to be in their early 30s, so his experienced eye figured them to be in their early 40s under all the makeup. From what he could overhear of their conversation, the redhead had just recently broken up with a Todd the Clod, and it seemed that she had never held on to relationships for very long. At one point, Christy had loudly remarked, "That's 2 this year already, Hannah. Maybe your Prince Charming just isn't out there." Hannah wasn't necessarily soft-spoken, but her end of the conversation was difficult to make out over the noise and music of the bar, with only a few decipherable words every here and there. Just as he thought he'd waited long enough, they were drunk enough, and he was ready to get up and go offer to buy them drinks, a tall, heavy-set man who'd walked in a few minutes earlier approached the pair, and Gil overheard him, the same as everybody overheard him say in a loud-ass voice, "Well, if it isn't fine-ass Hannah Dunn." Gil could tell that the redhead didn't recognize the other man at first by the reaction to being recognized herself, but that shortly then there was coerced from her memory a vague recollection of him. Apparently they had attended school together. Damn, Gil had been cock-blocked by the clock. His chance of intruding on their party now was pretty much shot. At least he hadn't wasted his money buying them drinks. He checked his watch, still 45 minutes until the next bus. So he ordered another drink and fed another 5 into the machine. This guy looked like a sleaze, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He knew the look. He could see the shift in the dynamic, and that the one with the tits was starting to feel left out. Gil thought to himself that the guy must be crazy to be chatting up Miss Prissy-Pants and ignoring the party girl. Then he saw the two get up to use the restroom, and boom, there it was. The long red braid came to the small of her back and had a little black bow clipped to the end, hovering over what had to be the ass of the century. Damn, so that's why he called her fine-ass Hannah Dunn. That thing was a gift from God, a 20 out of 10. Suddenly, he understood why the heavy-set intruder was so interested in her. When the girls emerged from the restroom, the brunette had obviously decided that she was going to leave as she shook the hand of what's-his-name and hugged her friend with the prize-winning caboose. Then she was out the door. 35 minutes until the next bus. He'd wait out another 25 in the bar and then make his way to the bus stop. So he'd missed a chance at possibly getting laid. It probably wasn't going to have happened anyway, even if he'd taken the chance. No big deal. Maybe if this guy leaves, he'll roll the dice with fine-ass Hannah. From the look of their interaction, there was no chemistry between the two of them. Maybe he'd have a chance. Maybe she'd never had the bad boy type before. Maybe that was her thing and she didn't know it. He'd keep an eye on the clock and on the level of disintegration between the goddess and the sleaze. Maybe he'd let another bus go by. Maybe he'd catch the next one. He'd reassess the odds when the time came. Miss Ass of the Universe must not have actually used the restroom, because she was back in it again 15 minutes later. She probably had just wanted to talk to her friend in private and assure her that she would be okay if she left her alone when they went to the bathroom together before her friend's departure. That happens all the time. She couldn't have actually gone pee because she hadn't been drinking so much to where she'd need to go again so quickly. Gil sipped his second drink, playing slowly, biding his time. Then he saw the sleaze get up and follow her into the ladies' room. Gil watched as the door shut behind him, then he got up himself to see what was up. That girl definitely was not the kind of girl that would tell a guy like that to meet her in the bathroom. Something sinister was happening. He pressed his ear against the bathroom door and heard her indiscernible high-pitched objections. He couldn't make out what she was saying, but it was clear from the tone that she did not want him in there with her. Gil tried to press on the door. The big guy must have been standing there blocking the door because it didn't give to his push the way it ought to have. Gil pounded on the door, getting the attention of the whole bar. Everything seemed to stop, and everyone saw the big guy slink out of the women's restroom and slide past Gil, who he'd stared down without saying a word. The guy very hastily collected his credit card from the bartender as Gil slightly opened the ladies' room door so that his voice could be heard from inside. "You okay in there, miss?" he said. The crowd at the bar could see that he nodded and then let the door close, her reply inaudible to any but Gil. Then he stood guard over the door until the sleaze left. Gil then tapped on the door, pushed it slightly ajar, and said, "It's okay, miss, he's gone." The hot redhead came out of the bathroom, her makeup still perfect. A woman of lesser fortitude might have been crying, but she looked as though she hadn't been affected at all. "You okay, miss?" Gil asked her as she came out. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, giving him a grateful smile and nod, surprised to see that, of all people, it was Tattoo Face from across the bar that had been the one to come to her aid. "He didn't do anything, he just gave me a scare. Thank you for coming to help." "Oh, it's my pleasure, ma'am." Gil nodded, and then he walked her back to her seat at the bar. Boy, this night had just taken a turn for the better. He took the seat next to her. Despite her unshaken facade, her hands shivered a little as she clutched her bag. "Wow," she sighed, looking at the exit. "Do you have a cigarette?" "Yeah," said Gil, retrieving his cigarettes and lighter from his pocket. "I wouldn't have taken you for a smoker." "I'm not usually," she said, "but I need when things like this happen." "What, does this kind of thing happen to you a lot?" Gil asked, a bit surprised by the sudden acknowledgement, but not really. He flicked his lighter and held the flame up so that she could light her cigarette. "All the time," she said, exhaling a big puff of smoke. "Being a pretty girl is dangerous. You can't even go to the bathroom by yourself." "That's too bad," he said, and he wanted to offer to buy her a drink. He really wanted to, but he felt that it would just be inappropriate considering what she'd just been through. She probably just wanted to go home, he figured. His night was a bust. There was no way he was going to. "So," Hannah said, "you want to buy me a drink or what?" Levity returned in almost no time at all, and the encounter that could have ruined the evening was all but forgotten. She'd learned that Gil was a reformed gang member who used to be in and out of prison until he met a social worker that took an interest in him and changed his life forever. Now he was working in a warehouse, saving money to have his gang-related tattoos covered up or removed, and he volunteered at a youth center where he would lecture kids about the dangers of getting involved with gangs. And he was single with no kids. He'd learned that the guy that had followed her into the bathroom was named Philip Goldman and that he was a jerk in high school too, but that she didn't think that he would hurt her. "He just had too much to drink too fast, I think," she'd said in his defense, even though she never really knew him and had no idea what she was talking about. She was one of those I see the good in everyone types, or at least she was at the time. He also learned that she was a former cocktail waitress turned real estate agent who was a very talented painter and poet, and she was also single with no kids. As she scrolled through the photos in her phone showing him her most recent works of art, He noticed that there were very few pictures of her in the collection of photos. Most pretty girls overload their albums with flattering pictures of themselves, but the pictures of her that did appear were not flattering at all, but rather candid. He learned that there was a lot more to her than her ass, and he listened to every word she said. When he told her that he was temporarily without transportation and was waiting on the bus, she offered him a ride home. He didn't ask for her phone number, but he gave her his. They had a few laughs on the ride, and despite having little in common with him, she thought that maybe there could be something there. They talked and laughed on the drive, and when they arrived at his trailer and said goodnight, Gil didn't lean in for a hug, but instead respectfully shook her hand. They were having so much fun chatting that neither of them noticed the car that had been following them from a ways back the whole way there. On the drive home, Hannah was beaming from having had so much fun on what could have been a very bad night, and was so distracted by her happy thoughts that she still didn't notice that she was being tailed. The car stayed far enough back not to be noticed, and if she had closed the garage door behind her with haste after she'd pulled in, the stalking driver would have not known which house was hers. As it was, she instead parked her car and then left the garage door open as she went inside to go and find her emergency pack. It seemed like she really only craved a cigarette after she'd had one, which was rare, but she kept a pack around the house so that on occasions where she had had one, she could have the obligatory second without having to buy any. While she was inside, rummaging through her junk drawer, the car that had followed her passed by, slowing a bit in front of her house before proceeding down the street a ways and parking some distance away. If her garage had been closed, he would have probably kept driving, but as it was, Philip Goldman now knew exactly where she lived. This was twice now that he'd been humiliated by her. He was going to give that tease what she'd been begging for and then kill her. She'd never stay quiet, he'd have to kill her. He watched her smoke, rubbing his privates through his pants all the while, then waited for her to go inside. A couple of minutes after he saw the garage door close, he got out of the car and popped open the trunk. He got out some rope and a towel. Then he walked over toward her house and waited by the water meter. He listened intently from the side of her house, waiting for the water meter to register. She was in the shower. He popped open the circuit breaker on the side of her house and waited a minute before turning off the power to her house. Then he traversed her driveway and hid around the other side of the house. He'd done this kind of thing before. He waited until fine-ass Hannah Dunn came out in a towel and slippers, flashlight in her hand, and phone to her ear. When she disappeared around the corner to check her circuit breakers, following her dad's instructions from over the phone, Philip Goldman opened the unlocked front door and disappeared into her house. She was 44 years old, but was in the best shape of her life, and even with her makeup washed off, still had a somewhat youthful face, and perhaps looked better straight from the shower than at any other time. She was perpetually stunning. The lights came back on, and she went back inside and rearmed her security system. He would have to kill her. She would never stay quiet about it. He would wait until she could be caught off guard. Then he would gag her, tie her up, rape her, and choke her to death. Maybe he thought he might choke her to death while he's fucking her. That might be fun. He'd killed 3 other women in exactly the same way before, but he'd never tried choking one out as he came. Maybe he'd try it in her $1 million ass. He'd never done anything this close to home before either. He traveled a lot, and he'd left a body behind in Houston, Sacramento, and Boise, and he felt a little trepid about doing his thing in Las Vegas, where he'd also incidentally relocated. Don't shit where you live, you know. But this was personal. He was a god, and he'd given that bitch every chance to receive his holy seed willingly. Now she would have to be taught a lesson, humbled. The chubby loner with the snide attitude had become a serial rapist and murderer. He had tasted what he divined to be true power and now lapped of its bowl as though a starving animal. This would make 4 women in 13 months. He had always wanted to fuck her. Everybody had wanted a piece of fine-ass Hannah Dunn, but he didn't think he'd ever get his chance, especially since she hadn't been his biggest fan in school ever since he'd called her on her bullshit for politicizing the notion of Sweet 16. He remembered. She may not have remembered, but he did. He stayed hidden in the spare bedroom closet and waited. He undid his pants and put a condom on his little erect penis. That way he'd be ready to spring at any moment. If he'd have tried any other bar that night, the chance encounter with Hannah would never have occurred. He'd always wanted to fuck her. Getting to kill her was just a bonus. Hannah put on her jammies, flicked on the TV, and scooched her back against the old heavy many-shelved headboard she'd toted with her on every move. She was in her chill place, and she relaxed, sat and watched her shows and ate her chips and salsa, never the wiser as to the presence of evil in her house. What was that today, anyway? It seemed like as soon as Christy left, that guy just switched into perv mode. He started talking to her very rudely, he started getting handsy, and then followed her into the bathroom to stop her from calling anyone. Thank God for her new friend Gil. She certainly wasn't smitten with him, but she would give him a call and say yes when he asked her out, and give it the old Hannah try. But she already knew he wasn't him. She believed in love at first sight, and she knew that if he wasn't it, he would never be it. She often speculated as to how much of her failure in love could be attributed to this notion that if she was not instantly in love with someone, she never would be, a sort of deprecating, self-fulfilling prophecy. But she still believed nevertheless, if love not in this time, then maybe the next. A line from one of her many poems. She watched 2 episodes of her show and then got up to put the bowl and bag of chips in the kitchen. When she passed by the spare bedroom, Philip Goldman quietly stepped out to stand behind her. He very suddenly wrapped the towel around her face and yanked her backward hard, saying, "I got you now, bitch." Chips flew everywhere and the bowl clanged against the floor as she was pulled back. She then tumbled to the ground, and he quickly twisted up the towel and started dragging her by her head down the hall toward her bedroom. Her cries were somewhat muffled by the towel, but more so by the strain around her neck. She flailed her legs around and tried desperately to grab at the towel that enveloped her whole head, but with the way she was being dragged, she couldn't pry the towel from under her chin. She broke down and started crying hysterically. Then she heard her attacker exclaim, "Holy shit!" and the towel fell from his hand and the back of her head hit the floor with a thud. With the frantic quickness of a mouse evading a snake, Hannah unraveled the towel from around her face, and then she saw him. It was him. As the blood splatter from her attacker's crushed head sprayed against her face like the fine mist of an ocean breeze, she felt it. She felt that rush she had been awaiting her whole life. Her breath was taken away. It was love at first sight. She had finally found him. He was magnificent, and he had saved her. She would never call Gil. It's too bad, he was a nice guy. She would never take interest in another man for the rest of her life. From then on, she would spend every waking moment that she could spare in devotion to the search for evidence of her Savior, her love, and all her effort would eventually pay off.